Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Great Heights Training. My name is Krista, and this is the webinar for remote A1 learners. We've decided to do this webinar just to cover a few of the main points that you've already got the DVD form, some of the lessons, and do more of the practical side, and also give the chance to everybody to ask their questions so that we could answer them, because I know we don't have time usually to do that on the phone, but with this webinar you have the opportunity to ask any question you have. All you need to do is type your questions as we go along. We'll be collecting them, and then we'll make sure that as we go on throughout the webinar, we'll answer questions that everyone has. Before we go on, just to let you know what we will be doing today. Throughout this webinar today, which is an hour's, we'll be doing, we will look at assessment planning, which is the first lesson that we've done, and also assessment methods. We'll look at that briefly. We'll also look at a sample assessment plan, which is to show you how it needs to look like and how to write it out when you do it with your learner. We'll also talk briefly about how do we go about getting NVQ learners, or learners that we need to use for us to do our own assessment and get the evidence for our portfolio. We'll talk about that later on as well, and throughout the webinar we'll be taking questions. So as soon as you have a question, just make sure you type them, and we will get them on the screen, we'll collate them, and we'll be answering them as we go along. And at the end as well, you can ask your questions, and even if you have questions, so that you don't forget, you can write them down or type them now, and at the end, during question and answer time, we'll be answering any questions that you might have concerning the assessment planning, assessment methods, and any of the topic that we will be talking about today. The first thing we will look at is, most of you now, you have done your first lesson, which is assessment planning. Assessment plan is what is a tool that as an assessor you would use to plan how you will be assessing your NVQ learner. Definitely there are different ways of assessing your learners, which most of you already have knowledge of, and you need to make sure that you plan that before you actually go out there and assess your learner. And the assessment plan is the tool that's been given to us as A1 assessors to plan ourselves. Now, the assessment plan is also something that we use to, every time that when you meet with your learner, every time you meet with your learner, you do an assessment plan to plan what you have discussed with your learner, what you will be doing with them, any assessment method that you will use, any assignment you give them. It has to be recorded on the assessment plan, because at the end of the day, the portfolio that you will be building for your NVQ learner when you become a qualified assessor is what will be presented to the IB, who's the internal verifier, and the EV, who's the external verifier. And based on that, they will look at the work that you have done as an assessor with your candidate and decide whether that candidate is actually competent to get their certificate. So the assessment plan is something there that will guide and show the internal verifier or the external verifier the different steps that you took in assessing your learner. So assessment plan needs to leave an audit trail. It's something that your IB or your EB will look at, and that will need to show them from the first time you met with your learner till the end of their assessment, what are the different things you've done with them, how often did you meet them, what did you do with them. So your assessment plan needs to be as detailed as possible to show all these main points. Your assessment plan doesn't need to be in such a way that you will say, oh, I met with Mrs. X, I said good morning to them. You don't need to go as deep as that, but it's just to show the main points. As we go along, we will look at an assessment plan sample, and you'll be able to see how it is done, what are the main things that needs to be written on it, and what is important on an assessment plan that needs to come up every time you meet with your learner. Based on the lesson that you've done already, we all know that assessment plans need to be agreed with our candidate, because as an assessor, we are not teachers. We are not there to teach learners. We're not there to give them orders or to tell them what to do. We are there to support them and work with them so that they can gain their NVQ qualification, because remember, most of those candidates are already working. They're already working in the area, whichever area it is, whether it's business admin, customer service, health and social care, hairdressing. Those candidates are already working. All you are there to do as an assessor is to support them, work with them to gather evidences that they can use to prove to the awarding body that they are competent in their job and they deserve a certificate. So therefore, you'll be working together with your candidate. So which means everything you decide to do when it comes to assessment methods, when it comes to how you're going to assess them, where you're going to assess them, it has to be agreed with your candidate. So you're not going to go there and tell your candidate, oh, I've got to come to your place next week to assess you. That's not the way to do it. It has to be agreed with them. You have to discuss with them and let them tell you if it's not convenient for them. You both have to be flexible so that it can be changed. So which means on your assessment plan, when you're actually writing it, you need to make sure that you mention there, we have agreed, whether your candidate Mrs. XYZ, we have agreed with X that I will be coming to her workplace to observe her on this date, that time, and I will be observing her on these different things. So which means everything you do with your candidate, when you're writing it on the assessment plan, which will record what you've agreed with your candidate, make sure you use the word agreed. That's very important, and that's one thing that internal verifiers and external verifiers look for. If you just put it there that I'm going to observe Mrs. X on this date, it will not look very good, and it might be questioned by your internal verifier. So you need to make sure that when you write it, because we know that when you're with your candidate, you are actually agreeing it. But for the IV and the EV to see, make sure that you use the word agreed when you write it down on your assessment plan form. The next thing we looked at was assessment plans need to be fair. It needs to be reliable, valid, and cost-effective. What it means is there are different ways of assessing your learners. When you are doing an assessment plan, you are actually discussing with your learner and you're telling them, these are the different methods that I can use to assess you. But you have to be fair in the sense that if your candidate doesn't like one method of assessment, maybe they are not very good at writing, maybe they are not very good at something, maybe you want to take their picture, they are not happy with that. So you have to be flexible in such a way that you will be able to change your method to suit your candidate. So that's why it has to be fair. It has to be reliable in the sense that any assessment methods that you use has to be reliable, which means an IV or an EV can actually check on what you have done and they can actually verify it. For example, one assessment method is a reflective account which your candidate writes. Now, how you can make sure that this is reliable is your candidate has to make sure that they sign it and they date it. If it's not signed, it's not valid, it's not reliable, which means it doesn't show, it doesn't prove to the IV or the EV that this is the actual work of the candidate. So you have to make sure that every piece of evidence that you collect, everything that your candidate gives you, has to always be signed and dated. Now the next thing is cost effective, which is very important. I believe all of you here, you want to become NVQ assessors so that you can make money and be profitable. So there's two ways to being an NVQ assessor. You can do it in such a way that it's not profitable at all, or you can do it in such a way that it's very profitable for you. And how it's profitable is when it's very cost effective, which means, for example, when you are assessing your candidates, make sure that you plan yourself very well so that you're not repeating yourself or you're not doing the same job twice, because when you did it first time you missed out on one thing or you forgot one thing. So make sure before you start even assessing your candidates, you plan yourself very well. You write it down and you plan how long it's going to take you to even complete one candidate, because if you just go and do it without planning, you will realize that you're spending a lot of time just working with one candidate, and if you have about 20 candidates, that's going to be too much. And when at the end of the day you divide the money that you're making by the number of hours that you're spending on that candidate, you'll probably find out you're making just £2 an hour, which is not very good, which I'm sure you won't like. So therefore, assessment plans have to be cost effective. So which means the way that you plan to assess your candidates, how you're going to do it, where you're going to do it, especially if you are very far and your candidate lives very far away from you. It's not very cost effective for you to travel every week to go and see your candidate. So you have to find the best method which is going to be cost effective for you, which means a lot of work. You have to start using a lot of technology, which is one of the things like this webinar. So you could be actually talking to your candidate online every single week, telling them what to do, giving them assignment. That is cost effective, rather than you traveling all the way from where you are once a week. That's going to cost a lot in terms of transport. So that's what it means. Assessment plan needs to be fair, reliable, valid, and cost effective. And it's very important, if you want to make money as an assessor, you follow those points, and that will help you as well. And another thing is why you need to know those terms is when you look at the knowledge questions. I'm sure most of you have done at least knowledge questions 1 to 5. You will realize that a lot of the knowledge questions are not very straightforward. They are not questions that you just have one answer for. Those knowledge questions are very wide. They have different meanings, and every candidate, every learner will interpret it in their own way, but it depends how you answer it. That's important, is how you put across the different points that you have. There's not only one correct answer for those questions, and some of those questions, they are not questions that you will just sit in a class and you will get taught about, okay, how to answer these questions. No, they are general questions. They are questions that some of them you will need to know some of the terms that we are using here. Some of them will be very wide and varied. Like, for example, there are questions on how do you encourage your learner to do better. This is not something that you will learn in class, definitely not. It's something that might entail a lot of research, that might entail you just using common knowledge. There are different ways of encouraging your learners. Everybody will use different methods. It might be by just encouraging them, by just giving them positive feedback, by giving them materials, by referring them to books they can buy. So those are answers that you will not find in classroom teaching, but there are things that they are common knowledge, or they are things that you as an assessor, you need to start thinking, okay, when I start having learners, how am I going to do this? Nobody is going to teach you how to do certain things as an A1 assessor. There are a lot of things that you will learn by yourself, by probably going on different websites, or some things that you, from your own personal experience, you will be doing. Now, this is what an assessment plan is, and this is how an assessment plan needs to be. The other thing is we talked about using different methods of assessing your learners. When you're doing an assessment plan and when planning how you're going to assess your learners, if you are in the area of health and social care and some other areas as well, you need to take into consideration that sometimes there might be information that are confidential. There might be data protection issues. So which means in certain cases, you have to be sensitive when you're planning your assessment with your learner, especially if in health and social care. You will need to make sure that a lot of times there are a lot more things you need to do. For example, if you're going to assess your learner or observe them in their workplace and they work in a care home, one thing you will need to make sure is always ask them, because your learner might not know, but they might need permission from their manager for you to even get in that care home to be able to start assessing them. So when you are doing your assessment plan with your learner, when you're planning it and you're agreeing it, always make sure you ask them as well and remind them to make sure they get permission from their manager, because it's not going to be cost effective for you to travel all the way to their workplace to assess them and they haven't actually got permission from their managers, and that's like a wasted trip for you, which means you won't be able to do what you have planned to do. So things like that need to be taken into consideration when you're doing your assessment plan. Permission from managers, if there are confidential issues, what things is allowed to be done in their care home, what things not allowed. And so things like that you need to just, as an assessor, with experience, you will get to know about these things once you start going out and assessing people. But for now, you just need to make sure that when you're doing your assessment plan with your learner, you cover every single area and you make sure you ask them a lot of questions, because sometimes they might not be aware of certain things. But when you are asking them, for example, like getting permission from their manager, or whether when you come there you have to have an ID, or whether you need to bring a copy of your CRB with you when you go to that care home. So things like that, it's good to always ask your learner what's the requirement, so that you don't travel all the way there and then you can't do what you have planned to do. So what we will do now, I'll just mention quickly different practical things in terms of assessment planning. As an A1 assessor, you are actually doing your course now, and you have to build your portfolio. which will then be shown to the internal verifier and the external verifier, who will have a look at it and then decide that yes, you are competent as an assessor, and and the awarding body can issue your certificate. While you're building your evidences, your portfolio, one of the things that's required is you will be working with 2 learners. They don't have to be NVQ learners who are registered with an awarding body. They can be 2 people who are working in the area that you want to become an assessor. It can be health and social care, business admin, customer service, whichever your area is. It can be 2 people that you know who are working in that sector. Even though they've already got an NVQ or they've got a degree, they are not actually doing an NVQ course, but you are just using them to be able to gather evidences for your portfolio so that you can pass your A1. So it can be anybody. And a lot of the work there, they won't be required to do much. They won't be required to do anything really. It's you as an assessor who's going to have to do everything in terms of gathering your evidence. The only time that you will probably disturb them or need some time from them is when you are actually doing assessment plan with them, which can be done in less than 15 minutes. And the other thing is when you go to their workplace and observe them, which is probably when you will have to have permission from their managers and from themselves. But it's not going to be like you doing a long observation. You're just there to do a quick observation. That's just to show, and it's only once that you're going to observe them. That's just only for you to show that you can actually do it and practice it. And when you are doing that, we will come down there and then observe you observing them, because that will have to write a report that will go in your portfolio. Now, I've emailed everybody. I'm sure you all have the email on the checklist of what you need to have in your portfolio as evidences for you to complete your A1. And one of the requirements, well, I just want to talk about the assessment plan side of it. You've got to have 3 assessment plans across 2 learners, which means you've got 2 learners that you are working with. You will need to have 3 assessment plan. Not each one of them will have to 3 assessment plan, but just 3 assessment plan in total. So which means one learner can be 1 assessment plan and the other one 2 assessment plans. So the requirement is you will have to produce 3 assessment plans as evidence to go in your portfolio. Now, one of these assessment plans need to involve you using a method that requires a third party. And one of those things will be like, if you, third party can be a manager, it can be a supervisor, it can be a team leader, and the assessment method to use that is usually, which is witness statement. So that's the main one. So what I mean is you've got 3 assessment plans to produce. One of them will have to show that you are using witness statement as an assessment method. Now, over the 3 assessment plans, make sure you mention all the different assessment methods that we have, and you all know the different methods, but we'll mention them briefly again after we've talked about that. So across your 3 assessment plans, you need to show that you've used all different methods of assessment. That's just to show the awarding body that you are competent, you know about the different methods, and you know how to use them, and you know in which situations to use them. And one of the other one is one of the assessment plan that you do for each learner, so which means 1 each, will have to cover 1 unit, and that 1 unit will have whatever method you plan to use to assess them. It will have to be a unit that you plan for them to qualify. So which means one of these units that you will assess with them, the assessment plan will need to show 3 or 4 different methods that you will use for your learner. Let's look at the different methods before I can explain that more. You can see on your screen that there's reflective account, which is what your learner will write, or they can write it, or they can orally talk about it, and it can be recorded. A reflective account is when your learner will reflect back on what they do at work. So what they will do is they will tell you a story of what they have done at work. Now, one important thing is before you get your learner to write a reflective account or do anything else, make sure that you give them the standards from the awarding body. So if your learner is doing an NVQ level 2 in health and social care, if it's from City and Guilds, NCFE, OCR, whichever, make sure that you give that to them so that when they are writing the reflective account, they can make sure they write according to the criteria set by the awarding body. Because if they just write a story there without really looking at the standards of what's required, you might get a reflective account that you cannot even use as evidence. So it's very important that you give your learner that. The next assessment method is observation, which is the biggest one because you're actually physically there on site observing your learner at work. The next one is professional discussion. Then you have witness statement, which involves a third party. Then you have work products, which is any work product that the learner does at work, which is letters that they write, care plan, reports, all these, they are counted as work products. Then you've got APL, which is accredited previous learning, which is any certificates of any training that your learner has already done in the past and that can be used towards the NVQ. That's acceptable as well. Then you have question and answer, which is another assessment method where you just ask your learner a question and they will give you the answer. That's just to show that they have the knowledge of doing something. So these are the different assessment methods. I'm not going too deep into them now because the next lesson has already been sent out to everybody, and that will cover all these different methods and what they actually are, how they are done more in detail. And if you have any questions on them, you can always send it to us and we'll reply you and send you back the answers. Now, I was talking about the assessment plan that you do for your portfolio. I've mentioned it briefly. You will need 3 assessment plans. So have in your mind that for your evidence for your A1, you will need to do 3 assessment plans with 2 learners. One of the assessment plans that you do with them will have to be on 1 unit. If you're doing health and social care or business admin or whichever, just choose 1 unit, which is a performance unit, that you will do an assessment plan for that unit. And when you're planning it, just make sure you plan it in such a way that when that learner does those things, they can fully qualify for that unit and they will get their certificate based on that unit. You're not doing it in real life, but it's a simulated activity that you're doing. So that if in real life you have a learner doing unit 214, for example, in health and social care, and the same way you plan it with your simulated learner is the same way you would do it with your real learner. And that everything that you plan to do will cover every criteria that they have to meet with the awarding body. So that's really on assessment plan and how to do it. But every time you meet with your learner, you have to do an assessment plan because that's what will be in your portfolio to show that you are actually working with your learner. And the next thing is when you write the assessment plan, it's very important that it's signed and dated every time you meet with your learner. If there's signature missing, IB will send it back. The next thing is with your learner, you will have to have, when you do an NVQ with an actual learner, like in real life, once you are qualified and you're doing an assessment plan with your learner, the portfolio of your learner should have at least a minimum of 6 assessment plans. So which means when you meet with your learner, you should have at least 6 assessment plans produced. So this is just to show, this is the minimum. You can do more than that, that's not a problem. But minimum requirement for an NVQ learner in their portfolio, it should have at least 6 assessment plans. And even if you plan to do something, you do not do it, make sure that you do another assessment plan and you write it there that we agreed to do that last week, but due to a change in circumstance, we've changed and we postponed it, because there shouldn't be any gap between the assessment plans that you do. When you agree to do something, you do it and you review and you give feedback. If for any reason it doesn't happen, you need to make sure that you record it on an assessment plan. You write a note there saying that this is what was meant to be done, but because of some problems, we haven't done it. It has been planned for another time. And you put it in that portfolio, because then that leaves an audit trail for the IB or the EV. When they pick up your portfolio, they can easily understand it. They can easily see the different stages and the different steps that you followed. Now on your screen, you can see there's a sample assessment plan that we've done. This is just to show you how one assessment plan can be written and what are the important things that the main points that needs to be there. You will see on the top left there is candidate. That will be the name of your candidate, which will have to be written there. The next thing will be the assessor, which is you. Your own name will be there. Then you have qualification. That will be what qualification is your learner working towards. Is it business administration, health and social care, customer service? Whatever qualification they are doing, you will write it up there where it says qualification. The next thing you will see there, it says level. What level they are doing. And that level is level 2, 3, 4, whichever level that your learner is doing. Then you will see there's something there called units. That will show, usually assessment plan, it's more cost effective to be done in a holistic way, which means you're not assessing your learner one unit by one unit. You are assessing them on every unit as a whole. So which means when you are working on your assessment plan, when you are meeting with your learner and you want to do an assessment plan, you can, at the top there where it says units, you can write all the units that your learners, or you can write all the units there rather than just one unit by one unit, because that's not good. It's always good to write all the units there. But for the assessment plan that you will do for your A1 award, the one that I said, you need to do an assessment plan for one unit at least that will be certified, which means one unit that's ready for the learner. If they do it, they can get their certificate. Then for that one, you can only write the one unit up there, the unit that you want to plan for that learner to finish, so that you can write the one unit up there. Where it says elements, you don't need to write anything. Elements are the criteria that the awarding body has, whether it's NCFE, City and Guilds, OCN, OC, or Edexcel, any of these awarding bodies. They have different units. They will have unit 201, and under that unit, they will have all the performance criteria. These are the criteria that you will be assessing your learner on. So they will have unit 201, criteria 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Most of the units have like 10 to 14 criteria. So you don't need to write the elements there, but this is just for you to know that those elements are the different criteria, the different pieces that you will be assessing your learner against. Now there's the date. It has to be the date when you are actually meeting your learner and doing an assessment plan. And the time is the time that you're meeting with your learner. Whatever time it is, just make sure you record that time there. Now, the main part of the assessment plan, which is the body there, this assessment plan is an induction stroke assessment plan. It's the first time that the assessor is meeting with his or her learner. And when it's the first time you meet with your learner, if you refer to the handout that you have, which is the first lesson, assessment planning, you have to do an induction with your learner. Now, I had one question before that said, isn't the induction done with a learner when they come to class or in a group? That's not the case, because it depends. If in the organization that gives you the contract, when you become an assessor, whoever gives you contract to be an assessor for their company, they will do an induction with their learners. But the induction that they will do will be specific to company policies, procedures. It will be about health and safety. That's what it's going to be about. The induction that you as an assessor are doing with your learner, it's based on NVQ, which means what is an NVQ? Telling your learner about the appeals procedure, telling them about the assessment, how it's going to take place, who are the people involved in the assessment process, and how you will be assessing them, telling them how you will be working with them, which is portfolio based, in case they think that there's an exam attached to it. Now you would think that, oh, the company who registered the learner for an NVQ should have told them what an NVQ is, which is good. It's no problem. The learner might know what an NVQ is, but you as an assessor, you are just doing your job by saying it again or by just giving a brief summary, because in a lot of cases, the internal verifier or the external verifier, when they are looking at portfolios, maybe they've got 15 portfolios and some of those portfolios are from you as an assessor, they sample portfolios and they usually call the learners. When they call the learners, they will ask them questions like, did your assessor tell you about appeals procedure? Did your assessor tell you who your internal verifier is or who your external verifier is? So that's why it's very important that as an assessor, first time you meet with your learner, you go through that induction checklist with them. You tell them about appeals procedure. All these forms are usually in your learner's portfolio, so which means you are just looking at the form, showing them, telling them what it is, and as they agree with you, they will sign it. So this I'm not going to go too detailed on this assessment plan. The assessment plan is already saved in Windows Live. For those of you who are already connected with us on Windows Live, you can go in the general information folder and you can download that assessment plan sample, and you can read it through so that when you're doing your own with your learner, you can follow that format. But this format is only going to be used first time you meet with your learner because of the induction part of it. But then you've got the other part, which is after the induction. Now, after the induction, you can it can be done the same day, first time you meet with them. It's always good, first time when you meet with your learner, to give them something to do. Because you don't want to just meet with your learner and do an induction with them and then say bye-bye, and you plan to see them in 2 weeks' time, and within those 2 weeks they don't have anything to do. Those learners will get discouraged, you might lose them, they might drop out. And now, as assessors, most companies will pay you per learner. So which means all these learners, they are equal to money for you, and you don't want them to drop out. You don't want them to not complete. You want them to complete as soon as possible. And how you're going to get that done is by making sure you have a very good assessment plan. It's not just this one page here. We will talk about, before you even meet with your learner, you need to sit down as an assessor and plan how you're going to do the assessment with your learner, what you're going to do with them, how long it's going to take you. Once you've got that sorted, it's going to be very easy when you go out there and meet with your learner. You already know what you have to do. It's not when you're meeting with your learner that you're going to be thinking, okay, for this unit, I think we're going to use a witness statement. For that unit, I think we're going to use this one. No, you have to plan yourself well before you meet with your learner. Because when you meet with your learner, you want to come across as professional. You want them to see that you know what you're doing. So, and you want to make sure that when you meet with your learner, you do not forget anything. You don't miss out on anything. And how that's going to happen is for you to make sure you plan in advance. You plan ahead. Now you can see on this assessment plan here after the induction that the assessor says they've they found out more about the learner's workplace. Very important when you meet with your learner first time. You need to find out where they work. You need to find out what they do in their workplace, because you don't want your learner to choose units that they don't really do at work. Because if they choose a unit that they do not do at work, it's going to be so difficult for you to get evidences for that unit. It's going to be very difficult for you to even plan an observation. That's why you are there as an assessor, to support your learner and guide your learner when they are choosing their units. You do not need to tell them what to choose, but you need to advise them based on what they do at work. If, for example, in health and social care, if a learner doesn't help their service users to eat and drink, they shouldn't choose Unit 214, which is helping individuals to eat and drink. So you need to make sure that as an assessor, you find out more about your learner when you meet with them before they choose their units. Now, the next thing we talked about is we went through the different units. So which means with your learner, make sure that you have all the units with you when you're meeting them. And then you make sure that you go through the units with them and let them choose their units. Explain to them about what's mandatory units, what's optional unit, and then you support them in that sense so that they will choose the units that is most suitable for them, that will make life easier for you as an assessor to assess them, because you don't want them to choose units that they're not doing at work, because that's going to be very difficult. And you always leave your learner with something to do. Like here you would see that the assessor said they've agreed, which is the word agreed, very important here. They've agreed that Joyce, who's the learner, would start on knowledge questions for the 2 mandatory units. So that's an assignment that you're giving your learner. Even when you give them assignment, make sure that you agree deadlines. You agree when you want them to send you those questions by. You agree a deadline with them. And the next thing they've agreed here is that the learner would write a reflective account in a holistic way and email it to the assessor on this date. So which is another thing, is another specific assignment that the learner has to do, and they have a deadline of when they will be submitting that assignment. So this is a sample plan of an assessment plan. It's a sample of how you write an assessment plan. If you go at the bottom there, you will see that your assessment plan, it has different signatures. Now remember, we talked about assessment plans have to be reliable and they have to be valid. So which means when you look at the bottom down there at the end of the assessment plan, you will see there's candidate signature there. So which means you have to make sure that you get your candidate to sign that assessment plan. They will need to sign it and date it. And you as an assessor, you will sign it and date it. And one thing is, you can see the candidate's comment. It's always very important for candidates to write a comment because it's very authentic. It actually shows the IB that the candidate was present at the time when you did your assessment plan. So which means let the candidate write a comment there. Sometimes they might tell you, I don't have anything to say. Tell them just write that you're happy with what I mentioned and you agree with everything that we discussed. Because let them write something, because that will add to the credibility and reliability of that piece of assessment plan. And you always need to also agree. When you finish the first meeting, always agree when you're going to see your candidate next. Very important. So you can see here that it's been agreed that the date of the next visit is the 1st of October, the time is 11, and the location is McDonald. So what I'm trying to tell you here is when you're working with learners, you will have different learners in different places. You do not need an office to meet your learner. You can meet your learner anywhere. You can see the location. As long as you have a location where you can sit down with your learner, you can have a chat, you can write an assessment plan. It can be anywhere. It can be a cafe, it can be a restaurant, it can be anywhere. As long as it's convenient for both you and your learner to travel to that location, it's not important. So as long as you can do that, so this is just to show you that you can meet your learner anywhere. It can be in a cafe, it can also be in an office, but everywhere you will be assessing candidates, it's not always going to be easy for the candidate to only come to one location, which is your office. So you have to be flexible in a way as well to travel to them and meet up with them in a place where they can actually sit down and have a chat with you, and also for you to do an assessment plan. So this is really on assessment plan and how it needs to look like. And if you have any questions at this point, you can type your questions, and we will make sure that we answer those questions. And the other thing that I would like to talk about is when you use those assessment methods. We've mentioned about the different assessment methods. Like I mentioned already, very important, before you even meet up with your candidate, make sure you have planned what you are going to do with them. Make sure that you already know the different methods that you can choose for different units. Even now that you are not qualified yet, it's very important for you to go on at least one awarding body's website. Can be City and Guilds, NCFE, any one of them, whichever area you want to assess, which is health and social care or business admin, customer service. Try and download the course specifications for that subject. It can be health and social care. So if you go on City and Guilds or NCFE, look for NDQ level 2 in health and social care or business admin or customer service. They always provide a lot of information. So you can download the course specification, which is usually like a handbook. That course specification will have all the units, which is very important for you to have, so that when you are meeting with your candidate, you make sure you have a folder with all your units for that course. And every unit will have the assessment criteria, which means the criteria that you will be assessing your candidates on. Very important, because when they are writing reflective account, when you are doing your observation, it has to be based on those criteria, because if you do not follow those criteria, you will not be able to cross-reference evidences. You will not be able to gather evidences that will be acceptable by the awarding body. The only evidence that's acceptable by the awarding body are evidences that will match those assessment criteria there. So make sure you download the course specification, you look through all the units, you look at all the criteria. Now, very useful information that the awarding body has is at the end of every unit, they give you suggestions of what type of evidence they are looking for. They give you suggestions of what assessment method will be suitable for that unit. So you can read through, and that will guide you, and that will help you as well, so that before you even meet with your candidate, you already have your folder with all the units, and next to the units, you already know what type of evidence you need for those units. You already know what method of assessment you can use to get those evidence. Once you have that, your assessment plan will be done easily, and you will easily be able to assess your candidate and gather evidences quick, and you'll be able to finish your candidate in a short time, because you've organized yourself, you've planned yourself, and you are just following your plan. And the more candidates you assess, it's just going to become very easy for you, because with practice you will just become perfect, and you'll be able to just assess candidates, write assessment plan without even thinking about it. Now, one thing that's very important, I mentioned about those assessment criteria. Now, every unit has about 10 to 15 assessment criteria that you need to show that your candidate is competent in. Now, all these assessment criteria, you will use those different assessment methods to get evidences for them. Very important for you to know that every assessment criteria has to be covered at least 3 times by 3 different assessment methods. For example, you've got Unit 214, Element 1A. That Element 1A, which is an assessment criteria, you as an assessor, you need to get evidence for that one element 3 times using 3 different methods, because most awarding bodies now, they require every single criteria to be evidenced at least 3 times, and those 3 times they have to be by using 3 different methods. They cannot be just observation, no. They have to be observation, reflective account, witness statement, or observation, reflective account, professional discussion. So you can mix and match the different assessment methods, but you need to have at least 3 assessment methods used for each criteria. And that's very important for you to know, so that when you are planning your assessment for your candidate, you take that into consideration and you make sure you always use at least 3 methods for each criteria. I would even recommend for you to go as far as 4 methods, so that if one thing is not covered by one method, it can be covered by the other. It's better to have more evidence than to have less, because if you have more evidence, your portfolio will easily pass. The Ivy will be happy. But when you have just 3 or you have 2, they're not going to accept it. So you have to make sure that every criteria is met at least 3 times by the evidence that you produce. And those evidence could be any of those evidences that we've gone through. Now, this is about the assessment methods. And I've talked about assessment plan. I've shown you the sample of the assessment plan. At this point, I would like to take any questions that anybody has on anything that we've talked about, or any questions that you have in terms of your course, or in terms of what you're already doing, or any knowledge questions, or if it has to do with working with your candidate. You can type your question on your screen and I'll be able to see that question and I'll be able to answer that question. So any question that you have, make sure you ask that question now, so we can deal with all these questions and everybody can get to hear the answers. And in terms of, so I'm just waiting for any questions to come through now. Okay, I've got a first question here, and the first question is, what is the induction checklist? I mentioned the induction checklist earlier. For those who do not have it, you can let me know. The induction checklist is a checklist that's it's on lesson 1 handout, which is got to do with assessment planning. And what it shows is, it shows different bullet points of what needs to be discussed with your learner first time you meet with them. Now, that checklist is always good to use so that you do not miss out on anything, because like I said already, the internal verifier, when they are looking at your portfolio, if they decide to call your learner, these are the questions they will ask your learner. And those questions, if you as an assessor, you have followed your induction checklist very well and you followed that, then you will not have any problem, because you followed it. Because most questions that the Ivy will ask the learner will be questions like, did you get an induction? Did your assessor go through the equal opportunity policy? Did your assessor tell you about appeals procedure? Did your assessor mention to you that there's an Ivy involved in your assessment process? Did the assessor tell you about the EV? So these are questions that the Ivy will ask the learner, and you need to make sure that you cover that, so that there's no problem, so that there's no issue, so that when the Ivy is speaking to your learner will actually say, yes, my assessor spoke to me about these things, and that will add credit to your own work. And if there's any other question, I hope this answers the question. If there's any other question, just make sure you send us your questions or give us any feedback that you want to give us or anything you would like us to talk about. Just send it to us. And I'm just gonna wait for more questions. Because if there's no more questions, I'm just gonna quickly round up and summarize what we've done. It's this webinar, like I said, will be every 2 weeks for remote A1 learners, because this is a good time for me to kind of briefly go over the lesson, give you a bit more information on it, talk a bit more about the practical side, and also answer questions that you may have, and also give you tips on when you're working with your learner, what do you need to do, and things like that. So that's why we put this webinar in place, so we can have that every 2 weeks. We can have that discussion. We can have that one-on-one. It's not really one-on-one. It's one on everybody else, but you understand what I mean. So if you have any question, you can still send them in now. Or if you do not have any questions at the moment, just want to let you know that you will receive an email to let you know when the next webinar is, so you can register. It's going to be in 2 weeks' time. It's going to be same time, 6 to 7, and just make sure that you register and you prepare any questions that you may have, and you just bring the questions in. But if there's no more questions, thank you all for attending today's webinar. I hope it was very helpful. And if you want to still email me your questions later, that's no problem. You can still do that. If you have any feedback, you can also email them to me. And if you have any suggestions as well, you can still email them to us, and we'll look at them and we'll see what we can do. Thank you very much, and bye. Have a good evening.